String is one of the simplest tools in my toolbox, and it's also the tool that will label you as either a pro or a beginner about as quickly and about as clearly as any other tool that you might pick up and try to use. Not only will the way that you use string and the tricks that you know about using string label you as someone who's been around or someone who doesn't know anything, it can also make a real difference in the accuracy of the job and whether or not at the end of the day the work you've done has to be torn out, or if you can go ahead and press forward because you did it right, because you used the string line correctly. Let me show you how you can set yourself apart from a lot of the guys in construction with a few simple string tricks. Nothing about what I'm going to show you is complicated, but everything about what I'm going to show you has to be practiced. So set up something like this, a little batter board, drive some nails into something that's sturdy, 15, 20, 40. The further apart you can get them, the more accurate it's going to feel, compared to a construction environment. So set yourself up some way to practice the things I'm going to show you with this string line, so that when you get on the job and when it's showtime, it's going to be as automatic as riding a bike. You won't have to think about it, you won't fumble, your knots are going to hold, and you're going to look like a hero. The first thing I want to show you is the two ways that I attach to a nail on a batter board. Is this complicated? No, but there's really only two things you have to think about. If your string line is brand new, if it's just coming out of the cellophane, if it's brand new, it's slippery, it's slick. And so to attach to the nail, I just tie an overhand knot and make a loop. Basic. And that works beautifully because you know it's not going to slip. You can pull that. If your string is used, if it's spent a little time out in the sun and if you used it a few times, it's not slippery anymore, and you can just put a lark's head on the end. See that? That holds nicely, and the advantage is that when you take it off, you don't have a knot to remove. You just have a good clean end. So I'm going to cut this overhand knot off, but keep in mind that's a very positive connection. I'm going to cut this off. And we're going to start with a lark's head. Render it down. Rendering down means to tighten. Swing it back and forth a couple times, and it's good. As a general sort of a rope trick principle, you always leave a little bitter end outside of a lark's head like this. So if it does slip, if it does render itself down a little tighter, you've got some space before your knot comes undone. Now getting back to the idea of taking this apart, you just grab the middle of that lark's head that's securing it and pull it open, and you're out. And now that'll go right back on your string line without a problem. A lark's head is a very versatile knot. I've learned on the channel that it's also known as a cow hitch. If you're using a line stake instead of a nail on a batter board, then one side of the stake or the other is the critical dimension. So you have to know which side of the stake you're going to be trying to use as your dimension before you put the lark's head on the stake. If this side of the stake was my critical dimension, I would put the lark's head on so it binds like that. If the other side of the stake was my critical dimension, the knot would turn over so that it binds like that. The bite of the line needs to be pulling against the loop. Let me show you what the problem is if it goes the other way. If I'm trying to memorialize this side of the stake and I have the loop oriented like that, the string is going to render around and pull out of the middle of the stake or just slip. See that? It just doesn't work very well unless you are coming back against the center of the knot. There's a couple reasons that the lark's head or the cow hitch is my go-to knot for starting a pull. First is it goes in so fast. Second is it falls out completely, which is fast. And the third is that I can originate a pull, and then if I want to start another pull out of the same string, let's just say that this is going off across the job site, and I want the middle of my string to start a whole nother pull, I can take that same string, put a lark's head in it, and pull twice off the same string without having to cut my line or put a knot in it that's going to mess up my spool later. I'll never have to take a knot out, and I can pull out of the middle of a bite with a firm attachment. and it comes out and there's no knot, and I come back over to the stake and it pulls out and there's no knot. So practice using a lark's head. It's just really a nice way to originate a string line. Let me just recap on these two knots for starting your pull. The only time I ever use a loop with an overhand knot is on a brand new slippery line. Occasionally a lark's head just wants to slip. But once you have confidence that your line's got a little friction in it, I just never tie a loop anymore. I always use a lark's head. Let me throw one other little piece of information at you, and that is batter boards are almost always used in conjunction with nails, and so the nail should always be tipped back just a little bit so that when you're pulling, the string has a tendency to work its way down the nail towards the batter board rather than having a tendency to work its way up. See, look, it's slipping there because it's up. But if it's down against the batter board, you've got some extra friction. So the nail should always be tipped away from the direction of the pull just a little bit. Works better. Most of the time, when you have batter boards or line stakes and string lines, you're trying for an accuracy that's essentially the accuracy of the width of the string. So it all matters. All these details are going to add up to, these details kind of layer. They layer, and the more accurate you can get with something as mundane as how you tie your knot and where off of the nail or off of the line stake your string comes to rest, it all accumulates to acceptable accuracy once the work is in place. With the end of your string firmly anchored in the right spot, now it's time to tighten that thing up and hold it tight. This is magic. If you're tightening to a nail, you use a fiddle string knot, or I've learned it's called an engineer's knot. Very easy. You form a loop around your index finger and then twist it up 5 or 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Not too many. Then with one hand, I use my left hand, I tighten the string, and with my right hand, I pull the slack back. Can you see that the slack is sliding around all those twists? And you can pull that as tight as your left hand will pull it. Tight enough to break it if you're not careful. And then simply pull the bitter end back and let it go. See that? Can you hear that? That's a tight string. That's a 40-foot pull. It has not sagged 1/8 of an inch. Works great. So here's the thing. It's the friction of that loose end winding around the tight side that holds the line. And that also makes it hard to take the friction out of it, to take the slack out of it as you tighten it. So don't wind it too many times. Let's experiment. There's 6 twists in it right now. Let's go 7, 8, 9. There's 9 twists. Here's the problem. It gets harder to pull that slack out. And in any case, you have to pull parallel. You can't pull sideways. The 2 lines, the one tightening and the one holding, have to be parallel. But then with all those twists, can you see that it stretches out too long? It's just kind of awkward. 5 is the number. Let's start from scratch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Get a good hold. Pull parallel. Bam. It's held. You can tell it's about right when it renders up, and it's just about, 3/8 of an inch long right there. Half of the beauty of the knot is how easily it ties. The other half of the beauty of the knot is how easily it releases. Bam. Gone. See that? Let's do that again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Drop it over the nail. Render the slack. Tight. Time to take the string down. Pull it back parallel to the line. Bam. You're free. How do you beat that? If you're attaching to anything except a nail, you're probably going to want to use what I call a binder. It's not even a knot. It's just using the way that pressure and friction work together to resist movement. And it works like this. You run the string by your line stake on the side of the line stake that is the correct measurement. You pass around the stake 1 time. And then as you pull it tight, you let the working side of the string come up and lay over the bitter end. Then you can render the slack much like we did with the fiddle string knot, pulling in both ends,
and then the pressure of this side, capturing the loose side against the side of the stake, holds it tight. I mean tight. Now the beauty of this is it goes on so quickly, it holds so firmly, and it unties in a moment, like this. And you're free. How do you beat that? The other thing is you can do this on almost anything you need to tie to. You can do it on the end of a board. I may go around twice on a board. You can do this on a steel pipe. And it'll hold. You see how much better that is than a series of half hitches and square knots and granny knots and who knows what? So this binder knot, this friction knot, is so simple. It's easy to overthink it and complicate it to where not only does it not work as well, but it doesn't work at all. One way to think about this is that you should realize that this does not work even a little bit on a loose string. It doesn't begin to do its job until the line begins to get tight. Let me show you. If I go around there and try to get that string to hold when there's no tension on the line, it holds nothing. But on the other hand, if I stretch that hard enough that I actually have to squeeze my hand and then wrap it around there and then roll that string over a half a turn, it's held. You see that? I like to combine those things, where while the line is slack, I throw it around and get it over the top, and then as I tighten it, it's already in the position to hold itself. But don't be confused by the simplicity. Play with it a few times, and you'll realize that the act of the tight line laying over the top of the loose line is what holds or binds or makes this little hitch work so well with the string. So as you think about this, you'll realize that this will work on almost anything. Now it works best on something with nice tight square corners like a beautiful square concrete stake. It will work on a round concrete stake if you go around twice. It'll work on beams, it'll work on almost anything with slight adaptations. Friction and gravity and all of these sort of elemental forces can work for us if we think about it and use our noggin just a little bit. So these knots are engineered, are designed to hold a string tight. How tight should a string be? The answer to that is as tight as you can make it without pulling your nail loose, without pulling your batter board over. They need to be tight. And the reason is because if you're working in the wind will push your string out of straight. If you're pulling a long distance, gravity is going to pull that string down. And a string that's not straight is worse than no string at all because you're assuming it's straight and you're building to an incorrect line. So the limitations on getting a string tight are two: how good a grip you have and how firmly the end of the string is anchored. So the key to all of this is practice. So you need to practice these knots sometime, somewhere where nobody's watching. And while you're at it, maybe practice cutting a string with your bare hands. I've got a video on that, and it goes like this. So that's not just a trick, that's also a tool. And there will be times when you'll be really glad you know how to do it. So there's nothing wrong with cutting string when you need to cut your string, and there's nothing wrong with tying pieces of string back together when you have a nice long piece that you want to put back on your roll. The knot that I like to use for joining two pieces of string line that I intend to use in construction in the future is a water knot. A water knot is so easy. It's two overhand knots, one reversing the direction of the first one. The reason I like a water knot in a string line is because it's compact. It's not a big bulky knot, and the line continues to pull out of the center of the knot. So you only have about half the diameter of the knot pushing your string off of a board or off of a, fill in the blank. You only have half the diameter of the knot pushing the string out of straight. The last reason I like it is because it never lets go with the loads that I put on it when I'm stretching a string. So to tie a water knot, the first thing you do is simply put an overhand knot in the end of your first line and leave yourself plenty of bitter end. Now take the other line, the one you're going to join to it, and take the bitter end of the second line and stick it into the overhand knot exactly where the other bitter end exits like this. Pull plenty of material. Now you're simply going to retrace the path of the original line through the original overhand knot. Like that. One enters where the other exits, and exits where the other enters. You can trim these down close. They're not going to slip out. And it makes a nice, clean, small interruption in your string line. My old strings have lots of knots in them and lots of pencil marks on them, because not only will a string establish straightness and it will establish elevation, it will also establish a distance along the string, like this. You can hook a tape, bring it down into contact with a string line that's stretched nice and tight, and put a mark on there. For instance, that mark is at 22 feet. Now that mark's a little hard to find, but if you pay attention, or maybe put a scrape mark on the ground, you'll know that, okay, right there is my mark at 22 feet. You can use that for establishing square by pulling an intersecting line or a tape measure at a different angle to verify that there's 23 feet from a known distance at a known line at a known elevation. It's a blackboard suspended right in midair. So just think of new ways to use a string line and they will get you out of a bind all the time. Let me show you how I do not wind up my strings. I don't wind them up like this because I'm winding a twist or a kink in the string as I go with every revolution. Not only that, but if I get a whole bunch on there and then store it, it's easy for it to just kind of fall off. You see that? When you just go around the middle of the ball, it'll fall off. What I like to do is to do it in a figure eight, because a figure eight does not put the kink on the string. It'll remain limp and pliable and cooperative. And not only that, if you hold some tension on the string as you're doing this, it will tend to not fall off in a mess in your toolbox. Now, winding it in a figure eight takes a little practice. I mean, it's a learned sort of a coordination thing. Holding the tension is a learned coordination thing. And you can't do it on too long a stick because it's just too awkward. But with the right length stick and just a little practice, you can wind it up and then maybe put a half hitch around there, pull it tight, and it'll be useful the next time you need it. It unwinds off a figure eight just as easily, especially if you put a little distance between your hands and get it started. And then just if you keep the tension even, it will pull itself off there pretty handily if you keep your hands apart. I had to use string a lot setting up these footings, like a lot. And I think I used every one of these tricks and processes and knots several times making this happen. So if you're interested in that and how they were actually used in a real life situation, check out some of these episodes on our house building project. There's going to be a lot of information there. You might have a look. And in any case, glad you're here. Thanks for watching.